Hello, and welcome to Bumps and Detours in the Spiritual Life. This is Father Joseph with All Saints Episcopal Church in Boise, Idaho. The spiritual life is often compared to a journey or a pilgrimage. But how often does it go that smoothly? Today we will use two metaphors to talk about some of the changes and challenges that we can find in our spiritual lives: bumps and detours. Because the spiritual life can be less than smooth and straightforward, we can sometimes catastrophize our spiritual lives and jump to a worst-case scenario. Perhaps we're saying to ourselves, I don't believe it the same way as I used to. I must not believe at all. Or why did this happen to me? Or this makes no sense to me right now. Therefore, it must not make any sense at all. I should give up. So what is a bump? A bump in the road is not just a little speed bump sort of thing, though even a speed bump can have its impact if your car is low enough to the ground. A bump on the spiritual journey is something that causes an abrupt shift in your spiritual journey. It turns what is smooth and makes it rough. Bumps can be from positive experiences or negative experiences, but we might recognize them more readily in negative experiences. Another thing a bump can do is bring us to the present moment. No more autopilot. Think, when you're driving your car and you're not paying attention and you hit a speed bump, you know where you are and you know you hit a bump. What are some examples of bumps in the spiritual life? It could be a shocking event in the news, perhaps, or in our personal life, or reading something that challenges the worldview we had, reading a difficult book, or perhaps reading a biblical story and having to reconsider what we think. It might be a moment when we see something from a different perspective. Perhaps we have an encounter with someone who's lived a very different life from us, and we have to embrace a worldview that includes their perspective too. Or a transition from one state of life to another. Perhaps getting married and discovering that marriage is a lot different than what we assumed in childhood. Or being divorced or widowed, or perhaps single after a really long period of time. It might be moving from a simpler form of faith to a more complex one, moving from a Sunday school level understanding of faith to something with more nuance and color and complexity. Or it might be a particularly painful moment in life that cuts deep into our sense of self. Bumps can be positive or negative as far as their immediate effect on us, but we always hope that ultimately we can make good come out of it, that the negative, the sadness, or the challenge is not the last word, but goodness. How do we respond to bumps in the spiritual life? Healthy responses would include being aware of our own reaction, being able to say, I'm upset, or I'm angry, or I'm sad. Being aware of what actually happened, being able to describe it, being able to put a name to it. Very importantly, there is an openness to change and to growth, an openness to the future that says, I don't know what's happening right now or what's happening next, but I trust that good can come out of it. I like to use this image to describe a faithful trust in God. Float in the boat that is God. Then in the midst of the turmoil of our lives, in the midst of all sorts of bumps on the sea, we are floating in God. So we don't need to be scared. We can trust that we don't have to have all the answers just yet. We can float. An unhealthy response might be doubling down on what we've been doing or thinking, a form of rigidity, where we assume that we have to defend exactly what we used to believe. It might be ignoring what happened, embracing a willful ignorance, assuming that, well, if we just ignore it, it didn't happen. That's not healthy. And a very unhealthy response would be giving up or giving in to despair. One that says, well, if I can't make sense of it, if it challenges me too much, then I'm just going to give up. That's not healthy either. Let me tell a personal story about a bump. So one time, I was having some difficulties with church, and I was busy complaining to God about all of it. Oh, I didn't like how this happened. I didn't like this. And then finally, I turned to God and said, you know what, God, I didn't think you were there for any of it. You weren't there helping me. And then it felt like a rubber band snapped. And all of a sudden, I felt these images of moments over the previous few months where God had, in fact, been with me in small ways and subtle ways. And suddenly I was having all of those brought to mind. And then it felt like God was saying, excuse me, Exhibit A. And suddenly I had to stop and I had to listen and pay attention. So how is this a bump? Well, God's the bump this time. God let me talk and express my feelings, but God jolted me out of my perspective to get me to see things differently. I was shocked and had to adjust. For one, God was showing me where God had been. It wasn't me noticing these things. It was God. And two, God was very present at that moment. And I had to respond. I had to change my perspective and appreciate that God is with me more than I realize, and that it's easy for me to forget when God's been present. My response in the moment was, yep, you're right, God. And so how did I change in response to this bump? There was a little more faith that God was present in my life. There was a desire to pay more attention to God's presence, because clearly God had been with me. I just hadn't been paying attention. And also the knowledge that arguing with God can sometimes get the results you want, much like the story of in the book of Job in the Bible, where Job is complaining and God shows up and Job is right. Now, what's a detour? A detour would be one of those periods in the journey when we have to go a completely different direction in our spirituality. A bump keeps us on the same road, but a detour is a whole new direction. Detours also involve a deeper change in ourselves. The path ahead suddenly shifts, or we have to take a new path. This can be a bit scary or intimidating, but like with bumps, we can appreciate that we're walking with God. So what are some examples of detours? Maybe rethinking our understanding of the Bible or worship. Maybe leaving a religious tradition or joining a new one. It could be an abrupt and complete change in our lives. Maybe some other examples? With a detour, the path we thought we were on is no longer possible. We have to move in a new direction. Even though the path has changed in a new direction, God is still present with us. Just like with bumps, there are healthy and less healthy responses. A healthy response to a detour in our spiritual life is knowing that Jesus is there for you. Even if you feel lost, remember that Jesus seeks out the lost sheep. Confusion and uncertainty are normal. You don't have to know how it will unfold. You don't even have to see that far down the path. Take time to pray. Wherever you go, turn to God. You might ask for guidance from a trusted spiritual person. And the biggest advice I would have from my own experience is to be open to the long road. Sometimes this detour winds up someplace surprising. And be open to the lessons learned. What did you learn from this path you were on? What might you learn on this detour? An unhealthy response could be despair. Just trust this isn't the end of your story. Another unhealthy response would be giving up on the spiritual life. Even if you have to go a different direction in your spiritual life, pay attention to your spirituality. It's a very important gift. Another unhealthy response would be becoming cynical and closing off our minds and our hearts. I didn't grow up Episcopalian. I grew up in a different tradition, and when I left that tradition, I kind of left God behind. I had a really hard time talking about God or talking with God, and so I kind of left it all behind. I had to go on a long detour of quite a few years of wandering spiritually. Spirituality was still very important to me, but it was really hard to talk about God or to pray. Eventually, I came back. I found my way back to Jesus. I'd missed Jesus, and here I am. I left behind a whole tradition. It was a radical break, but God was still present. God was still present even when I wasn't praying. I didn't know where I was going, but I knew that I had to go through a new path. I needed a different direction. If I was going to be able to look back and perhaps see where God was at work, I knew that I had to change the road I was on. God worked through this detour to help me be open to a new understanding. Just as I left that tradition behind, I was able to leave some other things, to leave behind things that weren't helpful. God helped me even when I wasn't able to believe. God was present. And God also used aspects of these detours to help me understand things in a new way. I discovered things about myself that I might not have if I had stayed on the path I was on. God works through many different ways. So now take some time to reflect. Looking at your own spiritual history, can you identify a bump or a detour? You might take time to maybe draw it out. Draw a straight line for when you're on a path, and then a little squiggle for a bump, and then go off at an angle if you're on a detour. Was it a completely different direction? Was it backtracking a little? Was it perpendicular or just a little to the left? How do you see God at work in that whole experience? For myself, it took years after some of these detours before I could recognize what God was doing. And then I could give thanks to God for what God had done. I also think it's important to consider what kind of advice you would give someone experiencing something similar to what you experienced. What would you tell them? What wisdom have you gained that you would share? Because we forget often to share the wisdom of our lives that we have lived, and when we look back and reflect, we have learned many things that we just haven't put into words yet. So how would you share this with someone else? Thank you for taking the time to listen to bumps and detours in the spiritual life, and I hope that it has given you a new understanding of your own spiritual journey and all the many ways it can unfold. Thank you, and blessings.